He started as an intelligence operative when the country was an apartheid state. It was under the apartheid regime. And he fought against apartheid, pushed towards democracy. He headed the Presidential Investigation Task Unit, and that was geared towards looking into high-profile individuals, including Vito Panizzolo, who at the time was believed to be a head of the Sicilian Mafia.
How do you watch out for your safety? And what precautions do you take? Do you prepare?
A difficult one because often I don't know who I'm truly answering. I often feel scared.
Welcome to Underworlds from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. My name is Mark Shaw. In today's episode, I'm speaking to Caryn Dolley, a prominent South African journalist who's written a book called Man Alone. And Man Alone profiles the career and life of a man called André Lincoln. Formerly an ANC intelligence operative, he was integrated into the new South African police service after the advent of democracy. He was handpicked by Nelson Mandela to investigate the Italian Mafia in South Africa, and he was drawn into a world of intrigue. There are very mixed views about André Lincoln, as Caryn explores. Many feel that he was corrupted in this process, and indeed he had to face and defend his reputation over many years, which he did successfully. He fell ill recently, he lost both his legs, he had a heart transplant, and in May 2025, as we were recording this, he passed away. It's a fascinating story of one man's struggle within policing in South Africa, and it exposes and shows just how dramatically the SAPS has changed over the years, has become corrupted, is subject to political influence, and has not always succeeded in responding effectively to organized crime. Caryn, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Caryn, give us some background on the book. You've written a number of books on the South African underworld. They've created a kind of stir and debate around organized crime in South Africa. But this book is a little bit different. It's about André Lincoln, a former ANC operative who becomes a police officer. Why did you take this approach? Give us some background to the book.
Well, it's quite bizarre because I'm an actively working journalist and have been for about 19 years. And throughout my career, I've covered organized crime, politics and policing, specifically in South Africa. And if we zoom in a little more specifically in the Western Cape, which is known as South Africa's gangsterism capital because of the prevalence of gang violence that leads to murders, it almost happened organically that I inevitably ended up following General Lincoln's career. He is now retired, but over several years, I would say over way more than a decade, I looked into themes that really form the foundations of his career. And that is, like I mentioned, policing, politics, organized crime, intelligence, suspicions of rogue intelligence. I would say it directed me towards him, but I must point out very clearly that as someone who was an intelligence operative, General Lincoln has been through a lot. And I think if you read the book, you will know that he ended up being criminally charged, criminally convicted, and he then managed to clear his name. So he did not trust me. And it's not that I set out to write this book. It was actually meeting with him as a journalist, chatting to him, and realizing retrospectively that I've actually sat through so many different court cases. I've covered so many crimes. I've covered so much political, I want to say almost like political overlays to policing. And it also seemed to lead to him and his career. And it's through that we got talking. And I think he realized in the end that I'm not here to make him look bad or make him look good. I explained if I were to go into something like this, and I told him he's got a fascinating life story. He really does. One that is absolutely worth having its own space. And he understood that eventually. And I feel that he did trust me in the end.
Caryn, when you say he didn't trust you, this is an interesting phrase. I mean, how did you know? Did you go and see him? Did he tell you that? Did you just sense he wasn't speaking?
So throughout my years as a journalist, which feel big significant now, he's been one of the police officers in sort of like a high-ranking police officer who has spoken the least to the media. And the irony is that a lot has happened to him. So much has happened to him. And I found that intriguing, but I also got the sense, given his history, given the fact that he worked as an intelligence operative when South Africa was an apartheid state, when misinformation was intentionally pumped out, and he says he is, in effect, the victim of misinformation, I understood that he would have no trust in a journalist, especially a journalist. So, yeah, I got a sense, and I also understood the background of this, or kind of felt my way around it and realized this is not someone who will be standing up and saying, this is my story. And that's really, throughout the process of writing the book, at no point did he say, this must be in the book. It was a slow process of piecing together different aspects, court records, interviews, and just chatting to him.
For people who haven't read the book, and the book is extremely interesting, it sort of is the arc of one individual's life in the context of this triangle of organized crime, politics, economy in South Africa, with a focus on the Cape, but not only on the Cape. Just tell people who are viewing and listening, what was the arc of André Lincoln's career? It's this unbelievable story that would have floored many other individuals, but didn't in this case.
I mean, it's truly unbelievable. It's like if you chop up different parts of his career, and I want to say life because he has given his life to this, but if you chop it up, each different segment is completely unbelievable. So I'll go through it very quickly, and not to give too much detail away for those who haven't read the book, but he started as an intelligence operative when the country was an apartheid state. It was under the apartheid regime, and he fought against apartheid, pushed towards democracy, and he put his life at risk as a result. Around 1994, he was absorbed into the Democratic South Africa's police service. And what happened there is, because there were different pockets of individuals, those against democracy, those pro-democracy, etc., it wasn't a nice homogenous police service. There was lots of friction, much like today. There was lots of tension, distrust, mistrust. So yeah, he became a police officer. Around 1997, Nelson Mandela, as we know, South Africa's first democratically elected president, appointed him to head an investigative unit. And that unit was to look into organized crime and potential links between criminals and the state, so figures within government. And what happened is, General Lincoln was accused of crime, and that unit imploded. And he spent years fighting his way to get back into the police service. He eventually did get back in, and it wasn't a plain, smooth ride since then. He retired in 2020, but his health has taken significant knocks. But what I did was, and what I really wanted to show, was how the trajectory of his career, which is up, down, up, down, up, down, lots of antagonism, lots of fighting. I've shown how policing in South Africa influenced that, or seems to have influenced it. So you can see under different presidents, different things happened to him. Under different presidents, different criminal elements were more prominent. So I really tried to show how his life mirrors what was happening in South Africa, and in a sense, what is happening in South Africa. And I think I want to point out that he started out being staunchly supportive of the ANC, and towards the end of the book, you'll see he has changed with regards to that.
He begins his career with this fascinating investigation around Vito Palazzolo, Mafia, money launderer, and he pursues an investigation at the request of President Nelson Mandela. He goes off and does this. Tell us about that, because this is the beginning of his targeting in a way.
Yes. So he headed the Presidential Investigation Trust Unit, and that was geared towards looking into high-profile individuals, including Vito Palazzolo, who at the time was believed to be a head of the Sicilian Mafia, and was suspected that he had links to figures in government, as well as police officers. According to police at that stage, Vito Palazzolo was sort of this high-flying kingpin, if you wish. I want to point out that Vito Vanzola was never convicted of any crime in South Africa. That happened in Italy. But yeah, what happened to General Lincoln is that he set out this massive major investigation, and it flipped in a sense because he became the one who was under investigation. And I make a point in the book of saying and explaining that in South Africa, and while not necessarily the case with the General Lincoln Vito Vanzola matter, what happened with state capture is that investigators were portrayed as criminals, or investigators were painted as dodgy. And that some of that, if we look at the South African Revenue Service, under state capture, investigators were painted as extremely dodgy. And that came out via the media, which is why I again loop back and say, I understood why General Lincoln may not trust me going ahead with this or writing anything about him. But yeah, he basically claims that because this unit sort of, I want to say, imploded, given the fact that he was criminally charged and accused of crimes, he says that that was the first true victim of state capture in democratic South Africa, which then goes on to show that what we've seen in South Africa since then, so we go from 1994 right up until now, 2025, we've seen the same thing repeating over and over again. And I want to also emphasize that what General Lincoln was looking into in the 1990s, potential connections between organized crime suspects, government figures, and police officers are exactly the same as investigations we know are being conducted at the moment in the Western Cape and further afield.
The book, it's a very objective overview. You have some sympathy clearly for General Lincoln. You also hold your judgment on some issues around his own actions in that investigation. I mean, do you think he made mistakes in the investigation? He, after all, was new in a new institution, which was quite contested. Did he show that in the interviews? You imply that he does by what you have written?
I would say that, firstly, I just want to point out that I wasn't covering this at the time. It wasn't what I looked into as a journalist back then. But in speaking to him, I get the sense that he is very adamant that the work he did was above any unlawfulness. Okay, he's very adamant that he worked by the book. Having said that, he's also very clear in the book where he says, perhaps he shouldn't have trusted individuals around him. So it's very difficult for me to say, did he make a mistake or did he make mistakes in this investigation? I want to step back and say, from my perspective, perhaps mistakes included trusting people who should not have been trusted. I know that General Lincoln's detractors will say he's the one that shouldn't have been trusted. And then I want to point out that we're dealing with intelligence and counterintelligence and extremely murky arenas. So it's really difficult, and I still find it very difficult to actually pull out one thread and say this is exactly what happened. Nothing is like that. But I think to sort of sum up my answer, and I think the book shows this itself, is that the truth often becomes apparent in retrospect. And individuals he accused or he suspected of wrongdoing, figures in South Africa's government who he said did X, Y, and Z, and not necessarily good X, Y, and Z. I think their own actions and accusations against them after that have painted a much clearer picture for us to extrapolate what likely happened.
Caryn, we've discussed this before, but in the murky environment of the Cape underworld, you do one interview and you get told something, you do another interview, you get told something. I mean, how do you do that? And the sense of threat that somehow hangs in the air when you're working or writing on these issues. How do you disentangle rather fact from fiction when you're working on something like this? Because I'm sure in other interviews you were being told other things. Tell us a little bit about your experience of doing the interviews and the writing process.
Absolutely. I know exactly what you're talking about, hearing different things. There's one event and you will hear you'll get 360 degrees of information around what could possibly have happened, what did happen. And yeah, different people have different truths. And I always explain this I hope it comes across clearly. But if we have a car and it's parked in front of you and I'm looking at it from the front, and it's got a red bonnet, I will tell you that's a red car. If someone's sitting at the back of the car and looking at it and it has black paint on the back, they don't see the red, they see the black. So they immediately, we've got two truths about one individual thing. It's a red car and it's a black car. The truth is it's a red and black car. And I always think about that when stepping into this, or tipping into this sort of mess, this rabbit hole of murk. And yeah, so I like to focus on what is irrefutable fact. And sadly, in organized crime, the irrefutable fact is often a murder. Someone has been murdered. There's sadly, tragically, a body. And I work my way back from there. And we know that there can be 15 stories wrapped around what actually happened. But I feel if we take all 15 stories, lay them out, you can find the most plausible ones. So we can take away, let's say, 5 of them already, look at the next 10, and present that as 2 main series. So yeah, I really try and step back. And I also try and keep in mind that one person's truth may not be another person's truth, but that other truth isn't necessarily a lie.
Caryn, you've played a prominent part, and of course the book and the story of André Lincoln is also part of that. In covering South Africa's underworld, you focused on the Cape underworld, which is, as you opened saying, is an important part of the overall story. What is the role of, let's call it crime journalism? I'm not sure that's the right topic, because as you make the point, it's connected to politics and policing and a range of other issues, the economy. What is the role of crime journalism in sort of South Africa's evolving transition, its democracy, and what's the state of crime journalism in the country in your view?
You know, I also struggle to define, am I a crime reporter? What actually am I? I don't actually know. So I'm with you on that. But yeah, I think it's important to remember that as a journalist, I don't just focus on crime. And I think that has made my job much more valuable, my output more valuable, because we can't say, for example, crime is gangsterism. And I've made this argument before, but organized crime saturates everything. Also want to point out that I always get this feeling that crime reporters are kind of, I think it's almost like we aren't viewed the same as, a true investigative journalist that is uncovering what is happening to the president, etc. But everything is linked. Everything is linked. And I hope the way things sort of shift is that we see more of those links. Infuriatingly, as a journalist, we rely on police action. We can expose things before they happen and we can put pressure on police to do things, but often we need to see the action to back up what we're writing, and perhaps vice versa. So yeah, it's difficult. Where I see crime reporting in South Africa at the moment, it's kind of everywhere. And what I try and do, and I feel that I can really only speak from my perspective, but what I try and do is show that it's also not just South African crime or the Cape underworld. Everything is interconnected. You can have a drug bust in the Western Cape that is absolutely linked to Brazil, which is then linked to Mexico. And I really hope that what I'm doing is sort of broadening the perspective of what organized crime is and who is involved in it, because it's not just the sort of prototype individual.
Caryn, how has the practice of your craft changed since you began? I mean, clearly you are much more prominent now, but I mean, talk us through a little bit, very briefly, your career. You start out looking into criminal issues. Has your focus changed? What's different about the environment now that wasn't in place when you began?
Well, firstly, the internet. I remember in the first newsroom I was in as a journalist, we didn't have internet access. I don't think I had a cell phone even. So it was very different. And I think that's actually served me incredibly well, because you had to go out, you had to talk to people, you had to meet people, you had to make phone calls on the landline. So I'm lucky, I'm very lucky in that sense that I started my career when there was no social media, because I also feel that I was doing it because we wanted to get a story out, not to clock up likes or not to become prominent as an individual. What has definitely changed for me is as I've grown up and older, is the way I view things. So I feel I can now put things into perspective, and I've got a lot of contextual knowledge with regards to what I write about. So that also puts me and shows me in good stead.
André Lincoln's career doesn't, I mean, both of you are working in the same environment over the same period. You weren't initially covering the stories, of course, where the book begins. What I was struck by in the book is the unbelievable resilience of this man. His health issues, he has both his legs amputated, he has a heart transplant. At the same time, he fights endless court battles. He uses his own resources to do that. Apart from everything else, what, in your view, speaking to him many times, makes him so resilient?
Not once has he lost his cool or temper when I've spoken to him. And I must say, writing this book, the process of this book was heartbreaking. So in so many ways, learning or understanding that organized crime has simply evolved and become much more muscled, and understanding that there wasn't even an end to what we're seeing now. That's heartbreaking. The fact that General Lincoln has been through so much, criminally accused, criminally convicted, acquitted, put into a position where he's fighting gangsters. His colleague is murdered. His legs, as you say, have been amputated. He's had a heart transplant, and he had that transplant while I was writing this book. So there was it was very emotional in a sense. And I think that speaks to exactly what you are asking. What else made him resilient? The fact that he almost comes across as aloof to the fact all this is happening, but you're also 1000% aware that he is not aloof. But he can control himself, he can control his emotions. And the fact that I've seen him standing on his prosthetic legs, he does not give up. And I mean, much less than this would break another human, I believe. Whether you think he's a bad person or a good person, I think what we cannot argue is the fact that a lot less could have broken another individual. A lot less.
There's no doubt. You walk away from this book wondering, goodness, would I have been able to match that level of resilience? I mean, it's absolutely astonishing. Can you tell us about his slow then more rapid fallout with the ANC colleagues, and he enters politics in a different, smaller party, very positioned to the vote in the Western Cape, and just give us a sense, or your reflection on his, well, I guess falling out, delinking from an organization which had been very important in shaping his outlook on the world.
Yeah, so in a sense, it's not really falling out. It's more that he decided, no, not for me. I think what I did with the book in sort of overlaying his life with what has happened in South Africa speaks to what you're asking. It answers the question, basically. This is someone who says he gave up his life for an idea, a struggle, or perhaps who pinned his hopes to this belief that things would change for the better for everyone. And we're sitting here today with a lot of tension in South Africa, especially right now. And I think someone, especially in General Lincoln's view, I can only imagine what it's been like for him to genuinely give up your childhood. You trained as a soldier, basically. You live your life in a very particular way. You are taught to sort of stand up, fight off the unjust, etc. And if you think about it, he was appointed to head the anti-gang unit in the Western Cape in 2018, and he's been in similar policing positions, but it would have exposed him. He would have had to inevitably look at situations, and from his very unique vantage point, I can't imagine how you can compare then to now, if there's much of a difference, if there isn't. And I'm speaking very specifically in terms of the way certain people are living conditions, not necessarily talking broader politics, etc. So I feel that he's turning away from the ANC and supporting the National Coloured Congress, which is the party he has aligned himself with. He explained to me that it's not to align himself with a particular group of people, it's just to stand up for people who are still marginalized. And I think that's important to remember, that he is someone who was trained to fight for something that never materialized. And perhaps from his vantage point, and I'm not necessarily speaking on his behalf here, but perhaps what he say is that it never got to that the promise never materialized.
Caryn, in all of this, and you recount it in the book, and I think you've covered this in the media yourself, a gang unit is established with a lot of fanfare, and the president arrived to launch it, and it was seen as a response to the incredible level of homicide in and around Cape Town in areas where gangs are prominent. But the gang unit is a failure, and he's deeply dejected by that, its resourcing. And can you tell us about that? I mean, how you covered it, what your initial feelings were? Did they change over time? Did his view change? Because the establishment, I'm putting my interpretive gloss on it, was that the establishment was a political act more than a operational response to gangs in the Western Cape.
So if you listen to General Lincoln, and there is a YouTube video on Daily Magic, where he actually talks about the anti-gang unit. But he said that it started out with a lot of promise, and I wouldn't say it was a failure. Arrests were made, arrests are being made, things are still happening, but the hype at which it was pitched to the public and even to police officers did not match up to reality. It has not matched up. I'm pretty sure, Mark, if I check my phone in 2 hours, I will be alerted to a shooting in Cape Town, the Western Cape. The timing of the unit was before a general election, and I have written before that it just seemed to be a gimmick to try and draw in voters. And I think that, for me as a human, let alone a journalist, is shattering. You sold people who are desperate for mere safety, who are desperate for space to walk and feel safe. You sold them this idea that something is going to happen. And I think it was known very high up in government that there was no actual real plan beneath the veneer of what was put to us. And that is almost in a sense unforgivable. People were promised safety. People are still being shot.
Was the gang unit a turning point for him? I mean, he was in charge. This was a very prominent position. He was the key individual to fight organized crime and gangs. Of course, there were others involved, but this was a key position in the Western Cape. How was it a turning point for him?
Perhaps this is the best way to answer it. I think beyond General Lincoln's situation, we had the murder, the assassination of Lieutenant Colonel Charl Kinnear, a police officer who was a member of the anti-gang unit. He was shot outside his house, fatally so, in September 2020. And I feel that that was a turning point for the country, because there was no way police bosses could ignore what was happening. A police officer was murdered, a police officer whose life was at risk, and this was publicly known information. A police officer who complained about other cops whom he said were sort of interfering with his work and that of some of his colleagues. So I feel that that was almost like a moment where everyone paused, and I feel that is when the anti-gang unit was sort of zoomed in on. It was magnified what is actually happening here, and that's where things became clearer. I also want to point out that around that time, General Lincoln's health also took a serious dip. So, yeah, it seems to have been a convergence of different things.
Caryn, I'm very conscious working in Cape Town and the Western Cape when I do, and I know this applies to you too, is that we talk about organized crime and organized crime figures and gang bosses and the like, but the enormous impact and suffering of ordinary people reflected in the quite cold statistic of the homicide rate. You yourself have mentioned earlier in the interview, you'll hear your phone will beep and there'll be another gang-related murder. Do you think that weighed on General Lincoln. He comes from these communities. He wanted and wants to make a difference. I think that sort of was something that drove him, that pushed his resilience, that he should survive all these health issues, court cases, attacks, as he tried to respond?
Absolutely. I mean, one thing he's made very clear is that what has stuck with him, or what sticks with him, is when a child is murdered. And unfortunately, and that is such a flippant word to use when referencing such a grave sort of reality, is that children are caught up in gang violence. Children do get caught up in gang violence. They are being murdered. I think just 3 weeks ago, I heard about a case of a boy who was about to turn 4, who was caught up in crossfire, and he died. So I think that really did drive, I don't want to say passion because that sounds like a positive word, but I think that really fueled his work ethic and his work. The fact that people are consistently, especially children, are being caught up. And also, he's chatted to me before about the different realities people live and how that affects one's mind. So, I can't imagine what it's like living in an area where there have been consistent shootings over X many years. You become conditioned to that, and that is not normal. And I think he has tried to push against that. And I'm going to bring this up because there are many people who still don't trust him and who will say he was part of that problem, that he is working with gangsters, etc. And this has come up before. He will categorically deny that. And I think if you listen to him talking about sort of people, humans, and not necessarily the work and the sort of operational plans and stuff, you'll see a different side to him. And I think I am privileged to have seen that, because as a journalist, remember, I'm sort of writing about the police officer, and I've never seen beyond that until this point. I've caught a glimpse of a human with depth of emotion that is quite shocking, and that's what makes it really shocking, that he survived all this, because to feel so much and to be able to put on this sort of very strong front is something I don't know how to understand even.
Caryn, you talk of intelligence, and this is a key part of the story, and you write critically about the South African Police Service's intelligence function, the state's intelligence function. Intelligence is this grey space where the state is talking to gangs, but people are becoming compromised. Intelligence is used to feed misinformation about Lincoln himself and others. And just talk about this context, this ecosystem of information and intelligence, which seems to be such a big part of the story. Lincoln himself is an intelligence operative, as are several other characters that you introduce in the story. Give us some background on the lever points, and it relates again, I think, to the information, the challenge of getting the right story, the fact and rumor and all that surrounds working in Cape Town and the Western Cape on the story. Sorry, I'm reflecting a lot because I myself have experienced it, and I'd be really interested to hear your feedback on it.
Completely understand. It's almost an exhausting arena because you're consistently getting different things. It's almost like you're intentionally pummeled with 17 different ideas at once to make sure that you don't figure out what's truly happening, which is probably what does happen. But yeah, just to sort of burst that bubble, when I spoke to General Lincoln about intelligence, he has mentioned before that it's nothing like 007 or anything like that. Intelligence gathering is actually quite different. And he explained it, I think it was with regards to a dam, a body of water, and how to protect that body of water, etc. And he said that is pure intelligence gathering. That's what it is. It's not sort of this cloak and dagger, smoke and mirror situation. But that does exist, and we can't deny that either. So, especially in terms of disinformation, we know that pre-1994, the apartheid government ran a vast sort of disinformation network / campaign called Stratcom, which a fraction of that involved placing stories in the media or getting stories out there to sort of discredit politicians, etc. And yeah, we know that has continued until it probably may still be continuing. I don't want to say that categorically, but it's probably still continuing. So, yeah, I think that's the most difficult part when looking into these arenas, is that there's so much intentionally spewed out smoke that it is incredibly difficult to figure out what's happening. And in the case of General Lincoln himself, he was an intelligence operative. I mean, we know that he said that. And so he had to create what he called a legend, sort of a persona. And this is where it gets difficult, because some people to this day believe what he says was his persona is who he is. And he says, no, that was a design. That was almost a costume to make people believe things. And I think that for me, as a journalist, is exhausting and infuriating, because you just don't know, like, even with a politician, is that person saying that to deflect from something, or do they truly believe that? It's really difficult. But yeah, like I said earlier, retrospect is something that often provides the truth. And we can weigh up things in a less emotive way, and we can see things and, actions speak louder than words. And we can then look at people through their actions over the years. The only catch with that is, and that's what we struggle with, is we see that after the fact. So when we're sitting in the current situation, how do we figure it out? I wish I knew.
Caryn, just to sort of bring together the many elements of the story, General André Lincoln was forced out of the police, pushed his way back in, was forced out again several times. Why?
So he was initially convicted of crimes which he said were concocted against him. And he stood by that stance. He said this, I was framed. And that's how he eventually managed to be acquitted. So he is no longer a criminal convict. Years later, he was reabsorbed back into the police. And I'd say this, and I try and explain it in the book. If he were legitimately guilty of certain crimes, would he have been reabsorbed into the police? There is the argument that, okay, if it's a corrupt system, absolutely, you would have been welcomed back in. But would he have been promoted to such a level? I don't know. So, yeah, he's sort of ping-ponged back and forth. He's been, like, after all that, after the Vita Panazzolo saga, after looking into accusations of underworld or alleged underworld kingpins closing up to police officers, he was reabsorbed into the police. And what did he look into? Accusations of organized crime figures closing up to police officers. So, I mean, and this is something important. I'm glad you sort of cleared my mind to get to this point. His career when South Africa was an early democratic state mirrors his career 2 decades, nearly 3 decades later, basically. What he was looking into then was what he was looking into after the fact. And I think that also reflects South Africa's reality, where a lot of people thought a lot would change, and yet we're sitting and we're like, ay, not so much changed in this regard. I'm not saying nothing has changed, but yeah, there are echoes of the past, very obvious echoes of the past. The reason he has consistently said he is innocent of any wrongdoing is because he said he will not allow this to be. He will not give up, because he has been taught that right is right and wrong is wrong. And I think I say that in the book. He's got a very sort of, for an intelligence operative who operates in a grey arena, if she's like a black and white scenario, wrong, right. And he will push, he says, to right. And he's never given up on that. So even post-2018, he's been accused of various things. His name has come out in a court case, etc., as being someone who is corrupt. And I'm pretty certain we'll see him push back, because he is not one to let a situation be. As much as he hasn't been very vocal with the media over the years, he has taken a very rigid stance in terms of legally defending his name.
Caryn, you mentioned earlier the case of the murder of Lieutenant Colonel Charl Kinnear. And this is a prominent local investigator. Of course, a number of senior police officers and investigators in South Africa have been assassinated. But his was a very startling case which changed in I think my view, the focus of the state on responding to organized crime in the Western Cape and to some degree nationally. There's a number of very big court cases now underway against prominent, if you like, mafia bosses. Explain Kinnear quickly, and then André Lincoln's role around that, because he, of course, has been drawn into that with a level of controversy too.
So yes, as you mentioned, Lieutenant Colonel Charl Kinnear was a member of the anti-gang unit, and that is the unit that General Lincoln headed at the time. And they were looking into, like I mentioned earlier, it's so bizarre, but they were looking into suspicions, allegations, accusations, what you may, that police officers were involved in creating fraudulent firearm licenses for criminal suspects. So that was just one investigation, okay? And Colonel Kinnear was involved in several organized crime investigations. He was clearly under threat at the time of his September 2020 murder, okay? In December 2018 already, Colonel Kinnear had written a long letter of complaints to his bosses. I stand under correction, but I believe it was 56 pages, in which he basically accused fellow police officers of working against him and some colleagues, siding with criminal suspects. And so when Colonel Kinnear was murdered, there was a big explosion of questions about why he wasn't under state protection when he was very clearly at risk of being targeted, which, I mean, worst case scenario would happen. His life was taken. I don't want to sound like I am talking about this lightly, but it almost became a finger-pointing mess in the police service about who should have done what, who did not do this, who did do this. And what happened was that prior to his murder, General Lincoln was involved in sort of informally or on the side assigning protection to Colonel Kinnear and his home. And that was withdrawn at some point because it was the festive season and they needed maximum police deployment elsewhere. And then more than a year later, Colonel Kinnear was murdered. And it turned out that Colonel Kinnear did not trust crime intelligence. Therefore, he didn't want to have his security assessed by them. But it also became an issue with certain police officers being accused of not ensuring his protection in the run-up to his murder. And General Lincoln was one of those police officers accused of not ensuring his protection. General Lincoln did counter that he was actually being made a scapegoat for the failure of his seniors. So, yeah, the Independent Police Investigative Directorate, which is South Africa's police watchdog, made findings about all this. They did a report, a very controversial report, because at one stage it was top secret, but it was already in the media, all a bit of a mess. But they effectively found that several police officers failed Colonel Kinnear. Among them, according to the police watchdog, General Lincoln, which, as we know, he's countered and said, that wasn't the case. I did my job. It's because people over year and year were not doing their job.
Caryn, I mean, just in one incident, you've captured just the complexity and the trauma and the degree to which telling the story can be so difficult. The Kinnear assassination, and of course the court case is now underway. What did you take from the Kinnear story personally? Clearly, as a journalist, you've been covering it. What was your takeaway in the sort of information morass of the Cape underworld?
So, I actually remember the exact moment that I heard Colonel Kinnear had been murdered. I wasn't in journalism at the time. I was doing research. But I had sat through a bail application that lasted a few months in which Colonel Kinnear was the key person testifying. And sat there day after day, never raised his voice once. Very, I would almost say shy publicly. I'm guessing that wasn't his persona though. But when I initially heard it, I want to say angry and shocked and just let down, and a big mix of big sort of drooping emotions, because even I, as a journalist, had heard him testify in court. He had testified in this big bail application that more lives are at risk of being lost, and the horrible, infuriating irony that it was his life hit hard. And what I took away from it was that we all know that there are pockets of corruption in the South African police service. We know that. It's not to say the whole police service is corrupt. There are very good police officers. But it left me with this feeling that something much bigger and something fundamental was amiss in this whole thing. Something we probably in another lifetime would not want to know because it's so big and so disgustingly wrong. And I'm still left with this feeling. At the same time, there have been sort of accusations informally made that Colonel Kinnear was corrupt that has never been sort of backed up effectively. And yeah, I still think it says a lot about the state of the state, that happened to a police officer, and that we are sitting here 5 years later, still quite uncertain about whether anyone will be held to account for the fact that he wasn't under security at that stage. And I mean, the flip side is that, as you mentioned, there is a trial. Individuals have been arrested for his murder and they are on trial at the moment. And we'll have to see what happens with that, if someone is eventually convicted for his killing, or if we'll be left with more questions. I just want to add one other thing. The actual gunman, the man or person that is believed to be a man who pulled the trigger on Colonel Kinnear, as far as I'm aware, has not been arrested for this crime. And that's another sort of, I mean, it gets lost in everything because so much is happening, but it's a very critical thing and it's very unnerving to sit knowing that we don't actually know the actual person who pulled that trigger.
Caryn, the turning, just as we draw to a close to your work, and you've hinted at it now, the news cycle on crime and gangs in South Africa and Cape Town is relentless. The stories move on so fast. How do you play your own role? What do you choose? You've sort of said you do some things because you want to make sure that there's coverage around the harms, but there's only one of you, there's only so much time, you probably are working on one story when something else happens. I mean, just give people who are viewing and listening a sense of the choices you make, your day-to-day work in this very, very complex environment.
So it's heartbreaking because we have to make choices. And like you've mentioned, there is only one of me, and I think about that every single day. I go to sleep thinking about that, and I wake up thinking about that because I know so much is happening. And there's just, even if we took every journalist in South Africa, I don't think we cover crime effectively. Or I shouldn't say effectively, I think that is done, but I don't think we cover the extent of what is happening. But what I try and do is focus, and I think I'm exceptionally lucky. And I want to say that I feel I've created a space for myself where I'm able to report on a very granular incident on the ground. For example, a terrible example, but a child has been murdered, and I get to chat to that child's family and sort of zoom in and show what has happened here. I also get to report on crime patterns, and they'll see, I've seen a flare-up of violence, and this coincides with X, Y, and Z. So I get to zoom out a little. Then I also make sure I put things into perspective. I sit in on parliamentary meetings, etc., to keep an ear and eye on what's happening with policing and interrelated departments, politics, etc. But I zoom out further and show what is an incident in South Africa or an incident in the Western Cape may be linked to another province. And this is why, this is how. And then I zoom out further and I also focus on global/transnational organized crime, because South Africa, of course, is not cut off. And everything that happens here, I mean, different countries influence each other differently. We've got an array of criminals from around the world over here. And I'm sure if I was sitting in a different country, I could say we've got an array of South African criminals in different countries. So yeah, so I really try, and that's where I think I'm actually lucky in that I'm able to do this. I'm able to focus on a very specific incident and expand and expand and expand and expand and expand. And I try very hard to show that that little incident on the ground is actually linked to that very sort of expanded view.
Caryn, what are your, I don't know, this is not a good phrasing, but what are the tricks of your trade? I mean, how do you approach an interview? How do you watch out for your safety? And what precautions do you take? Do you prepare? Can you grab people if you see them in Parliament or in the street? Or are there places you would never do an interview with someone involved in the underworld? Just give us a sense of your working practice.
So it's a lot of live and learn. I have obviously crafted a few things over the years. One of my big number one things is if anyone approaches me with information, why? It's very rare that someone approaches someone with information out of the goodness of their heart. There's often an agenda, and it isn't necessarily a bad agenda, but I really analyze why. Because especially in the organized crime arena, you need to be careful. And in terms of how I go about interviewing people, it's really a case-by-case basis. Sometimes it's not safe to go to a specific area. Sometimes it wouldn't be wise for someone to be seen with me, and I keep that in mind. I wouldn't want to put anyone in danger because just it didn't occur to me that it may look a bit weird. So I try very hard, and I think I've been successful for 19 years at not approaching people in their private space and time, or someone is out eating dinner. I've seen people I've desperately wanted to interview and have held back because it isn't necessarily the time and the place. If it was something that could really make or break or create a huge amount of safety instantly, I think I would probably now feel very differently. But it's live and learn. In terms of my safety, it's a difficult one because often I don't know who I'm truly angering. And like I said earlier, you can write about this person, and that is a puppet. You don't know who the puppet master is. So that I grapple with a lot. I often feel scared. And I think to just be cautious and always keep in mind, and that I've learned a lot from listening to General Lincoln as well, the depths and layers to different kinds of campaigns. If I were a political reporter, which at times I feel like because the two overlap and merge, just be very cautious of what is being put to us and always treat a press statement as a tip-off.
Can you say you are often scared? Is that because you receive threats or implicit threats, or your phone rings, or people make direct threats to you? Or is it just this general environment of uncertainty, which, as we've, I think, tried to show in the discussion, is a very big part of doing this work?
I think it's a sort of a combination. So I was threatened with being shot. I think that was 2017 because I wrote about police officers. Your book, Mark, your book focuses on that. So guns finding their way to gangsters, police officers channeling guns to gangsters, etc. I was told those guns would be used on my head in an SMS. And then, there've been sort of a few strange messages here and there. But for me, it's really not knowing who I'm actually, I don't want to say up against, because I'm not positioning myself against someone. I'm really doing my job, and I'm doing it as authentically and honestly and decently as I can. But it's the not knowing. And for what it's worth at the moment, the media, the way journalists are viewed, especially with what's happening in South Africa and international relations at the moment, there's a lot of I wouldn't say surface level because it's social media, but a lot of surface level hatred spewed out at us. So, for example, if you read Man Alone, you'll see that I'm not a supporter of a political party mentioned in this book, but you'll see I'm accused of accepting money and etc. from a political party. So there's also that sort of latent sort of fear that is here that social media is just social media, but when words turn into actions, if words turn into actions, that is a concern. And obviously, something I often forget, even though I live in the Western Cape, is that I live in the province where a lot of the people I write about are from, and I have before bumped into some of them. I've bumped into crime accused, I've bumped into suspects, I've bumped into people, and I mean, so it's quite weird. Like in my very personal, I'll share one thing. I used to have a gym contract somewhere, and I had to end that contract because I realized I'm going to the same gym as someone I'm writing about, someone who is not necessarily someone who would want to see me. So yeah, it does impact my personal life extremely. I'm very cautious about where I go. And I'm so scared of accidentally supporting organized crime as well. So that's another thing I keep in mind.
Thanks, Caryn. That's a very candid response, and I think is very interesting for people to hear. You have a profile, but you operate carefully, and to hear you say that you're sometimes scared, I think is a very honest response, and thank you for that. Can I ask one last question? It's what was André Lincoln's own response to the book? It's one thing to give a lot of interviews. I'm assuming, knowing you, you didn't let him read a draft, or he didn't comment or influence the book, and please confirm that. But what has been his response to the book?
So yeah, I didn't let him. I gave him a verbal flat plan of an idea I had. But like he said, let it happen organically, which, like I said, was me as a journalist who likes sort of rigid deadlines is horrified. But it did happen organically, and the manuscript changed a lot. It evolved so much. So yeah, I delivered a copy to him because I also felt that was the correct thing to do. I can't be giving out copies to my family and so things about this individual. And I didn't hear back from him, actually, and eventually...
And you were worried, Caryn. Can I ask you, you delivered it and then silence, right?
I wasn't worried. I was in the 1,000th millionth stage of anxiety. Like, what if I've done something wrong? Not that I tried to impress him. It's because I put a lot of my, I did it with decent and pure intent. And the last thing I wanted was to sort of trash someone unintentionally. But it turned out that he appreciates it. I think he appreciates it most because it shows all sides of him, and it's factual. The facts speak themselves. So yeah, and you will see that, like you said, it's an objective view. I can't say for certain this is the truth. There are so many truths, and it doesn't mean that another person's truth is a lie. It just means that is their truth.
Thank you, Caryn. That's a great statement on which to end. That's Caryn Dolley. She's really a prominent South African journalist, has been covering organized crime for years in South Africa. We've covered a lot of ground. Caryn, your new book, Man Alone, the story of a single police officer, a very courageous, resilient man in his own right. Caryn tells the story, and as you've heard, that story intersects with her own, which is how she has grown and learned lessons, how she practices journalism in the very difficult, often contested, and slightly sinister, sinister underworld in and around Cape Town and the wider South Africa. Caryn, what a pleasure to talk to you. A very big thank you to you.
No, thank you. It was an absolute honor to chat to you.